Good day to you. My wife Kelly and I are watching a series on Amazon Prime. It's called The Americans. It's about two Russians living here in the United States in the 1980s, but they are acting like Americans. You wouldn't know it. They speak like perfect American English, and they live the way that Americans do. And the episode today was kind of tough to watch because he is supposed to be sleeping with women in the United States, and she is supposed to be sleeping with men because it's all about getting secrets and conducting espionage. And today's episode has him leaning towards getting ready to sleep with what seems like a very underage female who happens to be the daughter of some kind of military official. And I wonder to myself, gee, is that really right to show that? It makes me squirm. Is it right to show that? You could decide for yourself if you've seen that episode. And then there was my Facebook page. I was looking at my Facebook page this morning, and up pops an ad for Viagra. Viagra? What? Is that really right? You know, suggesting to men in my age bracket that you'll reach a point where your natural body functions are not capable on their own. You need even something for sex? Yeah. There are lots of questions, are there not, about what's right and what's wrong in the media. And the answers to those questions are extremely individual because they are based on ethics. It doesn't make them any less easy to consider or more difficult to consider. That's the nature of ethics. We struggle with them, we tangle with them our entire lives. And so that's what we're talking about in our 14th chapter today. We're taking on media ethics, and it's a subject that takes us in a completely different direction than where we've been before, studying technologies. We're broadening now as we're getting ready to end the class to take a landing where we have a bigger perspective on the individual media that we've studied and the impacts that those media have had on society. Now we're going to discuss really larger, abstract, and presumably more meaningful issues. And it goes under the banner of media ethics today. And ethics is a way to decide what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. And what makes ethics different from morals, which you may also be tossing around in your head right now, what's the difference? A moral is individual. It's based mostly on personal experience. Ethics are based in a body of thought, a body of research that has been established going back to the ancient Greeks, so that we have what we would consider to be a foundation of thinking that is based on theory and speculation and thought processes that involve critical thinking, only that can be accumulated over centuries of compiling it. So we're taking on ethics today, and we're going to start with Aristotle. Aristotle is one of those ancient Greeks. He happens to be my personal hero because he had what is considered to be the biggest impact on the field of rhetoric, the field that I have my Ph.D. in, but he also had a lot to say about ethics. And just as a side note, he was the student of Plato. So Plato, the famous Greek philosopher, and Plato was the student of Socrates, also a famous philosopher. And then Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, who went on to become a great military general. So you've got four teacher-mentor relationship. You got four people in teacher-mentor relationships, so it's really significant in terms of the history of Western thought. Aristotle was the son of a doctor, by the way, and he turned out to be a polymath. A polymath is somebody who's really good in a lot of subjects. He was good at science, math, English, poetry. He was even good at poetry, Aristotle was. And one of the things that he became known for the most in the area of ethics was his idea of the golden mean. The golden mean. Golden is something we associate with being just perfect. It's warm. It's got a great feeling to it. And mean is not necessarily in the middle. It's a kind of middle position, but it's not exactly necessarily in the middle. What the golden mean is saying is that a person and a media organization, as an extension of a person, should conduct themselves in a moderate standard. That to try to avoid extremes is the best thing that a person can do in life. And that ultimately it comes down to a person's character in deciding whether you are engaging in one extreme or another. So let's say that you're a television programmer and you have to make decisions about what kinds of programming you want to offer your audiences. Ultimately, it's going to be based on what audiences are going to be watching the programs. They have to be big enough to show that your decisions were a success. But let's say you have a decision between programs that would go into the area of entertainment, And we'll call those anything from reality TV shows to sitcoms versus programs that have some kind of commentary on society, whether they're political, whether they're humorous like late night shows, whether they're documentaries, whether they're dramas in the evening, make comments about police, whatever. That's a tough line to decide between entertainment and seriousness. But the question is, what is in the middle? Can you find something in the middle that is not so much entertaining oriented that we lose sight of the fact that people are being killed, right? We love the fact that there's gunshots and blood everywhere, and that's what we're fixating on. Versus maybe another extreme would be that something so serious and dour, only covering poverty in a deplorable situation where children are starving. If it's too much of that, it's the other direction. So the golden mean is about finding that somewhat midpoint in your thinking individually, and then how that plays out in the media organization you work. Now let's move on to the next philosopher. His name is Immanuel Kant. K-A-N-T is a German philosopher. He actually was writing in reaction to Aristotle because, in part, the reason that he developed his philosophy, which is most well known as the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative by Immanuel Kant, he says, is all about, when you look at ethical behavior, it's not in the person, like Aristotle says. It's not in the character of the person. No, it's in the action of the person. That moral behavior lies in the way that people behave. And that since people have the capacity to reason through things, they should be able to follow some universal laws in life that they're just flat out right because of the behavior that results. Universal laws like you cannot drink at the age of 8 years old. Drink alcohol, I'm talking about. That's a universal law that you will find in almost every single country, protecting minors from the damage that alcohol could do, or the universal law that it's wrong to murder. Those are universal laws, and they are wrong or right in no matter what case. And so Kant is saying that you should not worry about the consequences of following your categorical imperative, your universal law. Don't worry about the consequences. Just behave that way, because that in and of itself is right. So, for example, radio stations in the United States typically will not cover teenage suicides. Even though there's no law that says that they cannot, they just won't do it. They don't do it because they believe that it could accelerate a domino effect. That young people, a lot of whom listen to radio, particularly pop radio, are very vulnerable at that stage in life. And if they see suicide as normalized amongst their peers, it may be just that enticing to them that it would cause them to pursue the same path. So radio stations do not air suicides, and that is a universal law that radio stations are following, that it's just wrong to do that. But what is the impact? Think about that. What is the impact? Is there a suicide epidemic that goes on in communities that those communities never know about because the media are not covering it? And therefore, the problem is not addressed. You can say the same about opioids, whatever. It's an interesting idea to consider, but it's the idea that there's a kind of inflexibility to this philosophy. You don't think about your consequences. It's like somebody says, hey, how do I look? And you say, you look awful. You're way overweight, right? That's a universal law. Tell the truth. Always tell the truth. But what's the impact on that human being? All right, let's go on now to the next philosophy that we're going to consider, ethical philosophy, and that is by John Stuart Mill, coming out of Britain. His philosophy, John Stuart Mill's, is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, usefulness, is a way to think about this. He says that utilitarianism is all about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. And to try and pursue that which causes the least amount of pain. That really what we're trying to do is we're trying to satisfy the masses here. So can you see how this particular philosophy works very well with mass media that are profit-making? Because you can say, you know what? This show is really, really popular, and it has a lot of people who are watching it. And whether it's degrading or just pure entertainment or false, that doesn't matter. All that matters is the size of the audience. Try and think of it this way. If I were to leave a room full of people your age and say, here's a radio receiver, put a radio station on, I'll be back in a couple minutes. when I come back in, what kind of radio station is it going to be on? Is it going to be a hip hop station? Maybe, but I don't think so. A country station? No, it won't be a country station. What will it be? Probably be a top 40 radio station. Why is that? Because top 40 radio hits, but not really hard hitting hits like Bruno Mars hits. That kind of radio is the least offensive to the most amount of people. So, in other words, the least amount of people will object to that than they would object to a heavy metal station, to a hip hop station, to almost any other station, because the content is dumbed down, right? It's not taking chances. It's not risky. It's not too ethnic, right? So that's what this is about. It's utilitarianism. It's the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And it doesn't always lead to the most scintillating, stimulating, and beneficial programming from a standpoint of human progress, but it certainly ends up in a lot of great entertainment. Now let's move on to the next ethical philosopher. His name is John Rawls, R-A-W-L-S, John Rawls. He's an American philosopher, and he says that which is just is also fair. They're not the same thing, right? That which is just is also fair, because justice is like a formal rendering of a decision about whether right or wrong has been committed. But sometimes the way that justice is administered is not fair because there are other circumstances. What are those other circumstances? John Rawls says that a lot of people don't recognize that people who are from disenfranchised groups, ethnicities, women, sexual orientation, from disenfranchised groups, those people are judged with a bias when they interact with others in media organizations. So we need to take away that bias, and what he says is we need a veil of ignorance. You know what a veil is? You put it across a person's face so that behind the veil you don't know what color they are, you don't know what they look like, you don't know their age, you don't know anything about them, and so you don't judge that person. And to illustrate this, he says, to illustrate the systemic problem here, says, if you look at the ownership and the management positions of broadcasters, you find very few African Americans and Hispanics. And so this particular philosophy gets at every time you have an encounter with somebody, you are trying to wipe away what you see in front of you as far as the physicality of that person. There's a veil there, right? And what you're trying to get to is behind their humanity, so to speak. All right, we're going to move on now from individual ethical philosophers to start to talk about perspectives. That one particular perspective, I should say, that was built by a group that was called the Hutchins Commission. The Hutchins Commission developed a way of thinking about ethics that was called social responsibility ethics. And the background on this group is Professor Hutchins. It was a professor behind this in Chicago, University of Chicago, and it was right around after World War II. And after World War II, this country was in a really bad way mentally because we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. There was a lot of fear about that Soviet Union, and the media were doing a lot to stir it up, to make people afraid of the Soviet Union's developing nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union's in Cuba just off of our shores, et cetera, et cetera. So the Hutchins as a professor got a commission together, and he said we need to develop an ethical framework that will help media to conduct themselves for the betterment of society, and he called it social responsibility ethics. And he said the basis for this is that media have a privileged position in society. They are lucky that they get to broadcast to millions and thousands of people every single day and print newspaper articles and let web pages fly. Because I, as an individual, I can't get to that many people, but a media organization can. So they're privileged, therefore they have responsibilities. They have responsibilities. They have to be truthful. They have to be comprehensive. They have to provide intelligent news. They have to provide balance, right? This comes back to fairness, coming back to balance. There has to be balance. If you report one side, Democrats, got to report the other side, Republicans. If you pro-choice, you got to report pro-life, balance. So we see a lot of that in our media. Now let's go on to another ethical perspective. I did have another one for you here, and that's the Bach model. The Bach model is coming from ethicist Cecilia Bach. So we have a female ethical philosopher here, and she calls her philosophical framework the Bach model. It's a model because it involves 3 steps, and the 3 steps are to be applied during decision making in the media. So the first step is to consult your conscience. And so, for example, is it right to show the body of a person who was just drowned in the Delaware River in a news report? Is it right? Well, it's going to be different for you than it might be for me, right? Like I'm saying to myself, as painful as that is, people need to see that so that they know how dangerous the river is. But lots of other people saying, no, 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 what about the relatives? And I can't look at that. So we have different, consult your conscience first, know what it is. Number two, seek alternatives. Is there anything else? Instead of showing the body, since that's what I would like to do, could I show maybe the hand? Or it's getting a little bit, morose here. What's the word for death? Moribund. Yeah, something like that. But you seek alternatives, right? You're pressing yourself into other ethical directions. And then lastly, hold an imaginary dialogue with everybody involved that you can think of. If I was the mother of the son who drowned in the river, how would I like the report to be? That's what she says. An intensely personal decision-making process, the Bach model. All right, let's go on to some ethical issues now. Ethical issues that are going around in the media all the time. And let's discuss what it's like for media to try and struggle with these. The first one is truthfulness. Truthfulness, there are lots of examples of journalists who made up stories. You can read about those in the book. Washington Post Juliet Cook is one of them. But is not telling the truth justified? Because in her particular case, she made up a story about a child heroin addict in Washington, D.C., but she also, in doing so, drew attention to a heroin epidemic amongst youth across the United States. So is it justified to tell the truth or not? That's something that media cannot always answer. And I guess it depends on the circumstance. It's a really vexing ethical issue. A second ethical issue is corporate conflict. We've already established corporate conflict in a way in this class, showing how Disney and lots of other big companies own media properties and what happens when they also report on those properties. What happens when they do a sitcom and they don't feature soda on the sitcom as being shown as causing somebody to be unhealthy. They're not going to do that because they have too many soda ads. There's a conflict there between making money and delivering the right thing to the audience. So corporate conflict is another area. Another area is sensationalism. Sensationalism, since most media are about making money, most media programmers, most people who come up with content on the web, they know that if you make something as dramatic and sensational as possible, you have more of a chance of getting people to look at it. In fact, in the internet age, there's a whole economy that's called the attention economy. The attention economy, it's just getting your attention. Because once your eyes are captured and you start looking at a web page, and then you're going to start sharing things, and then you're going to start posting, and then you're going to start liking, and then you're going to go to links on the page. And if you create video, your face is going to be captured in imagery, and that's going to be codified into data, and it's going to be sold that data. So on the web, it's the same thing. It's about money making, and money making drives the content to become more sensational. It's the whole reason that we stop and look at a car accident. We don't want to see somebody hurt. We can't help it. So there's sensationalism, and it's a problem in the media because it makes life over the top all the time in the media world. Another issue is photography. Photography is an issue in courtrooms. It's also an issue as far as letting cameras in because it may bias the jury. It may cause the defendants to answer differently. But also we have photography being doctored in news stories, and especially on the web, photos are so easily manipulated, and almost it's taken for granted today that a female who's a model, if you see a photograph of her, it's doctored. The wrinkles are taken away and other things are done to it. So photography is another issue. Now, ethics, how do you apply them? How do you enforce them? Is it possible to enforce them if your organization has a particular ethical framework that it wants its employees to follow? Well, one idea is the ombudsman. The ombudsman is a European position. We see it in a lot of European countries. An ombudsman should be ombudsperson, is a person who works in the media organization but doesn't work for the media organization. It's a person that you can complain to as a consumer to say, I was unfairly covered. And then the ombudsman makes a decision, and then the media organization has to print a retraction or issue a correction or apologize or allow the person to come on and explain their case. So that's one way. The ethics are enforced if your organization, and a lot of newspapers have ombudsmans and other, like I said, it exists in Europe. Then there's also the idea of a code of ethics, which many organizations have, especially news organizations. You go to work for a Fox, you go to work for CNN, you're going to get a booklet with a code of ethics, like you cannot accept gifts over $25, for example, so that you can't be bribed to cover a client favorably. Now let's move on to advertising specifically. Advertising is strongly criticized for being unethical. There's a lot of issues of truth in advertising. The use of that word free, for example, hardly ever means free. Usually there's some kind of shipping and handling charge, or you have to register for something, or there's an application fee. And other natural ingredients is another example. And other natural ingredients, which is to say that there are also unnatural ingredients in whatever it is that you're drinking or eating. So there's a lot of problems with truth in advertising. There's also problems with good taste. Good taste in advertising. Showing, for example, children in advertising is considered distasteful in other areas of the world, like Sweden. Children, they are not old enough to know what's good for them. How can you put them in an ad and create all that stardom that's going to create a life for them that they may not have chosen if their parents didn't want to? So there's good taste. And then there's also the ethical problem of controlling content like profanity and obscenity, which we talked about yesterday, or making sure that children's programming is definitely on television, which is done, or not allowing Facebook posters to stir up Nazi propaganda or KKK wordage. These are controls that exist, and should there be control? That's another area of ethics. So that takes us now finally to ethics in one particular area of media, which we've covered as a whole class. It's public relations. The public relations has a code of ethics that it released in 1954. It's a good example of a code of ethical relations. And the question that it asks is, who do you serve, the client or the public? So there you have it. Lots of questions with individual answers. Only you can answer ethical questions about the media. Have a great day.